Atossa Soltani was born in Iran, raised and educated in Ohio, and she lives in California. But the driving passion in her life is protecting the integrity of the Amazon rainforest and of the indigenous people who live there. It's hard to realize that even today, in this scrutinized, mapped, measured, and exploited planet, there are still groups of indigenous people living in virtual isolation in the dense woodlands of South America's Amazon basin. But there are, and they're a precious part of the human heritage. And their very existence is threatened by the industrial world's ravenous appetite for what we call resources: metals and minerals, oil and gas, hydroelectric power. Atossa Soltani is the founder and board president of Amazon Watch, an activist organization created to support indigenous people in protecting their human rights, their territories, and their cultures against the overwhelming power of international extractive corporations. She's a photographer, a filmmaker, and a media strategist who documents, publicizes, and resists the corporate assault against the indigenous people and their habitat. Amazon Watch also supports a school that teaches indigenous leaders how to assert and defend their rights and their lands. Atossa has organized several successful campaigns to persuade oil companies and other corporations to adopt more responsible environmental and social policies. She speaks Farsi, Spanish, Portuguese, and, very eloquently, English.
Amazon Watch is a nonprofit organization that works with indigenous peoples of the Amazon basin to protect their territories and advance indigenous peoples' rights. Founded in 1996, and it's been going on about 17 years. And we work pretty closely with indigenous movement across the basin and the Amazon. In particular, we're very focused right now in Ecuador, Peru, Colombia, and Brazil.
There's a wonderful story about how it got its name. Tell me about that.
Well, let's see. I had decided I was going to do this work in the Amazon. At the time, I was working for another organization, and it just so happened that the president of Brazil was giving a talk in Stanford. This is President Cardoso. And because the consulate had invited the organization I worked for, I wasn't allowed to use their name or do anything that might be jeopardizing the relationship with the organization and the consulate. So I showed up with a bullhorn, which I wasn't allowed to bring inside the auditorium, and then watched him give his speech. I had been very upset about the way that the president had been rolling back indigenous rights and planning a series of mega projects in the Amazon. So the talk ended, and I ran out to get my bullhorn. I decided it wasn't, any use doing anything inside the auditorium. So I ran outside, climbed on top of this planter, and grabbed my bullhorn. And basically, as he was walking by, I, basically confronted him about what he was saying inside and what he was actually doing in the Amazon. And he happened to have brought with him a plane full of journalists. It was election year, and there was also 20, 30 cameras from the Bay Area and the Brazilian media. And so as he's walking by, I'm confronting him, and he stops and looks at me just long enough for the media to get the shot of us both in the frame. He gets in his limousine and leaves me with all of these journalists doing an impromptu press conference. And when they said, "So who are you, and what are you, what is this about?" And I described what it was about. And when they said, "So who are you with?" and I took a deep breath, and I said, "Amazon Watch," just kind of made up the name at the time. And the next day was all over the newspapers. Amazon Watch confronts the Brazilian president. And so a few people called me who were actually, mentors of mine, and said, now you have to do it. You actually have to start this organization. And I'd already decided this is my area of passion and what I wanted to do for the rest of, foreseeable life. And so I went for it.
That's a lovely beginning. You kind of erect the roof and then you put the building under it.
That's right. I think the Amazon was already calling me. It was kind of, if you believe that plants feel vibrations and emit energy, the Amazon basin, the largest tropical rainforest on the planet, I truly felt like I was being called by the forest. I'd had, dreams about it. I'd, kept finding myself in these dreams in the Amazon and thinking, gosh, I have to do something or I might go mad. And so I'd already had a calling, and it was already part of my direction. It just so happened that action sparked a container for which this work has been
Had you spent a lot of time in the Amazon?
Actually, no. I grew up in Iran, migrated to the United States around the revolution when I was 13. I went through, I'd been a political activist from the very beginning, watching a revolution kind of go from nothing to, overthrowing the dynasty. It really did make me believe in people power and, political activism. And so when I was in college, my first, year in college, I had a beautiful housemate friend, became one of my best friends, and she was Peruvian, and she was studying conservation biology and spent time in the Amazon. And when she would come back from the forest and visiting these areas, she would tell me what was happening. And I just started to get literally, you could say, possibly obsessed about the forest, what it meant, what functions it served, the biodiversity. And then having these dreams, it just seemed like nothing could get me more excited and nothing could move me more than this place, the people, the biodiversity. It is really like not only the lungs of the earth, but the Amazon is really, a heart of the planet in the way that it creates weather, contributes to maintaining both the ecological and climatological balance of the planet. And so, I think it was kind of something that resonated with me and got planted, and so it took me 7 or 8 years to figure out how I was going to make a difference in that field. But in that meantime, I read any book I could get my hands on and, discovered the science of it, the ecology, and how, what was happening, the issues. And that prepared me for this work.
Did you actually get to the Amazon during that period?
I didn't.
This is all happening at long distance, I say this.
Yeah, for about the first 8 years, it was kind of a situation where I was a student, had a student visa, and I was in line for political asylum because of my family having to leave Iran. And I couldn't leave Ohio. I was actually in Ohio, and I couldn't leave Ohio for like 9 years while I waited for my green card. As soon as I got my green card, and I'm now a U.S. citizen, but as soon as I got my green card, first thing I did is go to Peru and Brazil and have an amazing adventure of, magical journey in the region.
It is magical. It's a magical place.
It is.
Yeah. One of the things that's often occurred to me, and I'm just curious if this seems to be so to you, is that Amazonia suffers from the fact that it's in several different jurisdictions, that if it were seen as a whole, instead of fragmented into a little piece that's Ecuador and a little piece that's Peru and so on, it might draw more of the attention that it deserves.
Absolutely. If you look at the Amazon basin, it's the size of the continental United States, so it's massive. And then you have 9 countries, 9 political jurisdictions that the Amazon reaches, expands across 9 countries. So you have all of these different policies and politics and different geopolitical, priorities. And so, yeah, it is seen as a fragmented place. In fact, a lot of the tracking that happens on deforestation in the Amazon primarily focuses on deforestation in the Brazilian Amazon and fails to report deforestation across the basin. But yeah, it is one huge watershed.
Not only is there that, but there's also the indigenous peoples of the Amazon who obviously don't have any particular interest in those boundaries and must be crossing back and forth and interacting all the time.
Absolutely, and this is, Ecuador is a perfect case example where for about 40 years there was a war between Ecuador and Peru over territory, and that meant that the border was cinched up and there was no movement across the borders, and you really had a situation where the same people, same tribes, like the Achuar, like the Shuar, like the Zapara, and Quichua, they were definitely divided across the political boundaries and unable to visit each other. So there was about a 40-year period until not too long ago where the same families had been split across the border and could not go back and forth without being called traitors. And now that's changing, but yeah, it's an interesting reality. There's still a lot of border politics, you could say, but more and more indigenous peoples are starting to organize their people across boundaries.
Now, Amazon Watch runs a school for that, right? That trains indigenous leaders in how to confront some of the issues that they're dealing with?
Well, we've been involved in a number of training programs. One of our main, theories of change is that really it's about supporting, empowering, and accompanying indigenous peoples in order to help them become better advocates for their own rights and for their own territories. And so in that sense, we have been involved in a number of initiatives to bring training around media skills, working around communications, actually donation of equipment like ham radios or video cameras and laptops, GPS units, helping indigenous peoples tell their own stories. We in fact trained one indigenous leader from the Quechua community of Sarayaku in developing not only camera skills but then to edit videos, and he went on to become an amazing accomplished filmmaker. Last year his film about his people and their struggle to fight against oil companies won number one film in the National Geographic All Roads Film Festival, which was really a great achievement. So yeah, we've been helping indigenous peoples. Back then we were helping them sign up for email accounts, and we were supporting a school in Peru that's about bringing indigenous peoples knowledge of their rights, their collective rights under national and international law, their ability to campaign to get their message out, and their ability to speak to the media and help get their stories out. So that's an example of one of our training programs.
The people who were here at the summit that we've both just finished attending, there were some very, very impressive indigenous leaders. And one of the things that struck me about them is how they're not shy and they're incredibly articulate. Is this part of what the culture is in the first place, or is this also the enhancements of this kind of training?
Well, you can't totally generalize. In the Amazon basin, there's some 300 plus, between 300 and 400 indigenous cultures, and within those cultures you have a range of very peaceful, quiet, soft-spoken indigenous communities, and you have the warrior tribes. Now we happen to be in Ecuador, where the central southern Ecuadorian Amazon is home to a number of warrior tribes, which at one point were at war with each other, and now they are united in kind of confronting the outside world in terms of oil companies and mining. And of course the other thing is that indigenous peoples have traditional systems of decision making where they sit in assembly, and they're very much an oral culture, and everyone speaks until everyone stated their opinion and a consensus is reached. You have a system of inclination towards democratic decision making, and where again there's a culture where everyone speaks their mind. So that's what you see here.
So there's a real premium, or there's a real value placed on being able to express yourself orally.
Yeah, and in fact some of the leaders who make it to become regional or national leaders are the ones who have developed a real strong skill set in their articulation.
Yeah. Is it fair to say that throughout the region, the major problems come from extractive industries? Is that a fair generalization?
That is a great way to frame it. I mean, if you more broadly speaking, it comes from this mindset that development, what is called development, the development paradigm that's imposed by governments and regional authorities. I mean, often the Amazon is seen as an empty space full of natural resources to be exploited. And basically that's been the predominant framework around which policy and governance has happened in this area. So yes, it's seen as empty space where, which is not the case. Indigenous peoples have occupied these spaces for thousands of years. It is seen as a place where development, a country can exploit these resources to basically fuel its national development. And of course that's been tragic for the region, for the people. So you have industries like oil and gas and mining. You have large-scale infrastructure projects that aim to integrate and dominate and connect these interiors, these wild interiors. And so these are, for example, roads, waterways, rivers being dredged to create waterways. You have large-scale energy projects like dams, large dams that block rivers and flood huge areas of the forest. And you have massive agricultural projects or agribusiness projects like plantations of palm oil and soybeans. And of course, cattle ranching has been in the lowland rainforest a huge driver of deforestation, especially in Brazil.
You say that the area is seen as being empty, nobody there. That's actually been stated pretty blatantly and openly by a number of the people there. And it seems to me it's fundamentally racist, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, it's basically seeing the tribes that live there as dispensable and expendable. And often you hear some of recently as a few years ago, the president of Peru, for example, former president of Peru, saying, these people are like guard dogs. These indigenous people are like guard dogs that are hoarding and protecting the garden and keeping the rest of the population in poverty. They want to hang out under the tree, not let any of us have the gold. That was his discourse. They should just assimilate into national society and let us get along with our development plans. And so it's seen as very racist. Same thing that happened in Canada and the U.S. But it's happening now. I mean, you still have indigenous populations in really remote areas of the Amazon who have either no contact or very little contact with the outside world. And they are defending their territories, which may be millions of acres of pristine rainforest. And so, yeah, it is definitely the battle to conquer these frontiers that happened in Canada and the U.S. is still happening right now today in the Amazon basin. If you look at things like biodiversity, which is the number of plants and animals that you find around the world, and if you look at resources like oil and gas and mining and minerals, you basically could do an analysis across the world, and it would show that somewhere around 80% of all of the biodiversity on the planet is found on indigenous people's lands. And you probably somewhere close to that when you look at resources on, where is the last of the mineral deposits, the oil deposits, and the timber deposits. I hate to call them that because those are not what those places are. Those places are ecosystems that provide vital functions for the whole planet.
Mm-hmm. And when you talk about territories, you said these tribes are defending their territories. Something else I just like to elicit there is that's not the way they would see that, right? They would see it more as habitat. They don't have a sense of property. Property is something that's kind of imposed on these situations.
No, they do have a sense of boundaries of their ancestral land. I mean, most of these tribes see their land as living forests or living entities. They see, they know exactly which mountains are sacred, where their ancestors are buried, where they get their timber, where they get their medicinal plants and the wood for their canoe and special medicinal plants for certain ailments. They walk these, and they have stories, and these are living landscapes which have meaning to them. And they know from this river basin to this mountain to this forest is their ancestral lands where their, many generations of their people have occupied and cared for and are in direct relationship. They do ceremonies. They have an interaction with these forests. They know where to hunt, the animals that they eat. They know where not to hunt to allow regeneration of those species. They do sometimes have common hunting and fishing grounds where a bunch of tribes indigenous groups might share an area, but for the most part, they are living in these large areas, in some ways as in living indigenous nations. And so we call maybe in the U.S. we call them indigenous, we call them tribal lands, or we call them reservations. Here they call their lands and their territories.
Yeah, but it's a very different sense from thinking that it's property that's bought and sold, it's exclusively yours, you can do anything that you want with it. The whole Western approach to what land and territory is.
Absolutely,
right?
It's a collective concept. Families might have their own plot of garden that they cultivate and areas they care for. But as a nation, as an indigenous nation, there might be dozens of villages of the same indigenous group that look after an area they see as their parents. And they see this area as their sacred lands. And it is a collective concept. It's not an individual concept. It is a collective concept. It's part of their identity of who they are. They were born from these mountains and these rivers. It's a whole different concept of relationship with the natural world, and it's not something to be bought and sold. It's not property. And often they say this is our mother. For us, it's extracting oil is worse than killing our mother. We're not going to accept it.
You've got two views of what it is to be human in collision whenever you get one of these industrial developments in traditional Aboriginal territory or indigenous territory. And
yeah, if we all went back far enough, maybe a couple hundred years, 300, 400, 500 years, we could definitely see in most of human civilization, in most of society, this is how we lived. These were the values we engaged in. It was reciprocity, caring for the land took care of us, we took care of the land. We were part of this system. And you find this I have a chance to work with the Amazon Watch in the Amazon Basin, but also with another organization called the Christensen Fund in other parts of the world. So I've traveled to Central Asia and Papua New Guinea and some of the other regions of the world, to Kenya and Australia, and I've gotten to see indigenous peoples caring for their land and their way of life. And it's very universal, this idea that we are part of the land, that we give to the land and we receive from the land, in this infinite cycle of reciprocity. That is the way most people have lived communally. It's only in the last few hundred years that we've changed our ways to being individualistic, family units, driven by growth and wealth accumulation and property accumulation. That's relatively recent in human societies.
And then when the two collide, well, let's talk about the Chevron Toxico case, because there's a case where an oil company came into a previously untouched part of the rainforest, and tell me what happened.
So in the late 60s, Texaco was the first oil company to arrive in Ecuador, and they went to the region of the Amazon where there were still uncontacted indigenous populations and lots of forests, no roads. They discovered oil, and they basically signed an exclusive agreement with the Ecuadorian government to drill for oil, build a pipeline, develop the whole oil industry for Ecuador. Over the course of 20-some years, they basically drilled for oil. This was, using technologies back then that would have been illegal in the United States. And most importantly, they made a decision to have the system just dump their toxic wastewaters into the rivers and streams instead of injecting it back into the formation where it came from. So you had something like 18 billion gallons of toxic waste flood the forests, the streams, plus you had oil spills, continuous oil spills. You had, every time they drilled a well, there was over 900 wells drilled. Every time they drilled a well, they dumped the drilling muds and the toxic chemicals into these ponds. So you have this area 3 times the size of Manhattan, that is completely polluted. And of course, this was an area in the United States. Decades ago, they would have put a fence around it and called it a toxic waste site and evacuated everyone. But here in the Amazon, the tribes lived in this area. 5 indigenous tribes were affected, and other people came following the pipeline and the road into the Amazon, and the settlers, the farmers, established their base across this region, and they started to basically live along the pipeline, live along the road. And in these areas where there was toxic waste in the rivers, in the water, in the groundwater, and every time it rained, the waste pits would flood, bringing chemicals, soups that basically flooded their gardens where they grow their vegetables and their crops, and basically fruit trees. And so there are this population, which is about 30,000 people, 5 tribes and about 80 villages of settler communities, are systematically poisoning themselves over this course of the last 30 some years. And so Texaco left in 93, around 93, after, extracting all of this oil. It left and said, okay, we're done, out of here. It left their decaying, polluting infrastructure to the Ecuadorian government. The case was brought in 93 in the United States against Texaco because Texaco made decisions in the United States to design this highly polluting system. So since then, since 93, Texaco was bought out by Chevron, and the liabilities that Texaco has in Ecuador became liabilities of Chevron. And so the cases continued to go on, for the first 10 years in the United States, and then Texaco and Chevron argued that the case should be heard in Ecuador. The case was brought back to Ecuador. In Ecuador, it's been going on since 2003. It's gone through the district court, the highest court, and recently the equivalent of the Supreme Court found Chevron guilty and ordered the company to pay $9 billion in reparations for everything from bringing clean water to drinking water to the communities, to helping remediate and clean up the soil, the waste pits, the streams, etc. And this is incredibly important case in corporate accountability. It's one of the most important developments in corporate accountability, holding a company accountable in a court of law, allowing people, everyday people who've been harmed by this huge company with huge amounts of resources, to basically have a claim for justice. And of course Chevron has continued to deny it's responsible. It's basically attempted to discredit and evade justice. It's brought counter lawsuits against the lawyers and the plaintiffs. It's attempted to silence the nonprofit groups like Amazon Watch that are working on the case. And really, it's literally has 60 law firms, some 2,000 lawyers and paralegals fighting to basically evade justice. And most recently brought cases attempting to say that against the lawyer, one of the key lawyers in the case in the United States, in a court in New York, saying this case is fraudulent. But ultimately, we believe justice will prevail, and this case is actually coming to Canada, where Canadian people can have an opportunity to themselves learn the truth about the case and form an opinion and call for justice in a very important case that's basically saying that a Canadian court recently ruled that the plaintiffs in Ecuador, the indigenous people in the farming communities, the 30,000 people, can basically bring their decision of their Supreme Court to Canada and ask the Canadian court to opine on the validity of the case, so that if the Canadian courts agree, they can seize Chevron's assets in Canada to pay back the $9 billion that was the judgment from the case in Ecuador. This is significant. This is really maybe one of the ways that we can use this idea that transnational corporations attempt to be above government rule. They attempt to be, evade justice in one district, in one jurisdiction. And here, banding together, we can actually bring case in another jurisdiction to enforce the judgment.
It's nice to see some pushback against that abusive corporate power that's been going on for so long.
Yeah, it's been a long road. This case has been going on for 20 years, and it is incredibly demoralizing at times to see how much Chevron can distort the truth, how much they control the mainstream media, how much they've been controlling the courts in the United States. And pretty much they've probably spent somewhere around $400 or $500 million just in recent years defending themselves and doing PR and ad campaigns. When you think about how much that money could have actually gone to help bring justice to the communities, to the villagers who all have cancer, who have birth defects, who don't have clean water, who eat polluted fish. Most of the tribes who live along, I don't know if you got to visit some of the indigenous groups along the Aguarico, but the Cofan, for example, their rivers are so polluted that often you see them eating tuna fish in a can. Then they live in an Amazonian river that, normally would have an abundance of fish, and that would be the main diet of many of the indigenous groups. So, it's pretty tragic. And to see that Chevron says something, the CEO of Chevron says, we're going to fight this case until hell freezes over, and then we're going to fight it out on ice. It's pretty demoralizing. But at the same time, seeing that there are courts that are willing to challenge corporate power, and hopefully the Canadian public and the media will get behind this case and allow for justice to actually be served, finally.
Well, they brought it to a country where there's lots of freezing and lots of ice, so maybe they just came to the right place.
Yeah, exactly.
The reason that they are fighting this, have been fighting this so hard, has to be that they're worried about the consequences, not just the $9 billion, that's not such a big issue to an oil company of their size, but what's the ripple effect if this is successful?
Yeah, it would set a huge precedent for companies that have been polluting and dumping and leaving, places like Nigeria, and other places where the companies have basically attempted to operate outside of public view, kind of operating without kind of the legal structure to enforce any kind of environmental regulations. So it is kind of like the tobacco cases. The very first ones helped pave the way for a whole number of cases, and I think that's what we're seeing, is holding these companies to account would have huge repercussions for other corporations. And also it's already having an impact. Already it's almost like, the industry's been studying this case and really hopefully taking some lessons away. But I know that when we deal with the oil industry, in fighting oil industry entry into other areas, this case comes up all the time in conversation. Well, we're not going to be like a Chevron. We're not going to be like that. And of course they make promises, which I don't believe, because I've never seen any kind of oil development in the Amazon region that didn't cause irreversible, permanent harm. Things like, opening roads into the forest that then lead to further deforestation, decline in biodiversity. Oil spills are a given. It's not a question of if, it's a question of when. There's pipeline ruptures. You're talking about an area that, it rains 80 inches and more a year. You have flooded forests, you have huge mountains, landslides that happen often. Pretty much the entire forest, the Amazon forest, there's so much water and so much movement. It's almost like drilling offshore, because these areas are so hard to get to, and a spill would be impossible to clean up. And it's just a matter of time where, these areas could get polluted with oil development. And unfortunately, when you look at the Ecuadorian Amazon and the Peruvian Amazon, the majority, between 70 and 90% of these forests have been slated for future oil drilling. And either some of them are already going ahead and there's exploration and new production, and some of it is, seen as the next decade. But it's unfortunate that such an important global biological, diverse place, and such an important sacred land to so many indigenous peoples, which has so many other ecological functions, like regulating the global climate and being a storehouse of the world's biodiversity, home to species like the jaguar, home to majority of the species of plants and animals on the planet. There's more species of fish in the Amazon River basin than in all of the oceans. There's more tree species in 1 square kilometer of the Ecuadorian Amazon. 1 square kilometer of Ecuadorian Amazon has more tree species than in all of Canada and the US combined. So here in this most amazing, crucible of life, actually these areas like the Yasuni National Park, which is currently being threatened by oil drilling, were around during the last ice age, and were a refugia for where the species of plants and animals that survived there and then repopulated. outlying regions after the end of the Ice Age. And so these areas are critical for the planet, and they're critical for our weather system, for the way, for our hydrological cycle. In fact, the amount of moisture and vapor that rises over the Amazon basin, the largest, tree-based landmass on the planet, creates so much heat and vapor that drives weather systems and rainfall. It is like the planet's rain machine. And so much of the agricultural production, even in the US and Mexico, depend on the rain and vapor and moisture that's recycled by the trees of the Amazon basin.
That's an amazing description of an obviously hugely amazing place. Let me turn to another area, because it seems to me in terms of fighting back, there's the kind of work that Amazon Watch and the indigenous people and others have been doing, but there's also the rights of nature movement that we've been paying so much attention to in the summit we've been at just lately. How much difference would that make if we had rights of nature accepted as part of the legal system, say across the board,
A huge difference. I mean, the rights of nature originates in the indigenous philosophies of natural law and, or original instructions. You often hear indigenous peoples talk about our natural law, original law, which often has to do with a cycle of reciprocity and respect for the earth, their mother. And from that comes this concept of the legal doctrine of the rights of nature, where it says nature has a right to exist and flourish and continue its vital cycles and be respected, and it be a subject of law, not an object of law. And in that sense, it would be huge if a river had an, basically identity and allowed to stand in court just like any individual, have standing to basically, and it's up to people, the rights of nature says it's up to all of us to bring cases, to enforce, to defend those systems, the sacred mountain, the river, the forest, the living forest. And I think that, of course, we were all so incredibly inspired when President Correa first came into office and held a constituent assembly. Alberto Acosta was named the president of this assembly. He's one of the foremost advocates for the rights of nature. It was this huge convening. The whole country embraced the subject. The Constitutional Assembly basically adopted a new constitution that recognized the rights of nature in the Constitution, as well as other principles like the goal of government, the goal of society is not wealth accumulation, rather it's living in harmony and balance with nature, a concept from the Quichua here in Ecuador, Sumak Kazai. And so the whole idea of, the purpose of development, the purpose of society, the purpose of government, and these rights of nature concepts were integrated for the first time by any country. That was a huge source of inspiration for all of us, and we basically thought, well, it's going to get easier. We're going to have some ways of enforcing, the protection of these forests and cultures. However, in actuality, this government has turned out to abandon its commitments, to only pay lip service, but in actuality be continuously developing these regions, handing out more concessions to oil companies, putting large-scale mining, building hydroelectric dams, prosecuting and harassing organizations and individuals who are defending the rights of nature, and basically cracking down on anyone, including the media, who dares speak out against the government. And so it's been really a disappointment.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. What about the broader movement? The rights of, we had here people from I don't know how many countries, but countries all around the world, for about a week, talking about rights of nature and how to go forward with this whole movement. How do you feel about that?
A really exciting development. Everywhere I go, when I give talks to the university students or environmental organizations, the whole concept of rights of nature has incredible power, an incredible people get very excited about it. And it's akin to, at one point we thought slavery was okay. At one point we thought women shouldn't have the right to vote. At one point we thought human rights, was not acceptable. And those things we changed. Over time, our values shifted. We started to say, indigenous peoples have rights, human rights, women's rights. And so I think it's only a progression to start seeing that nature has rights. And so, but I think we have a long way to go. We are facing, we are getting more and more people excited about rights of nature. There's been some great strides on the local level in terms of local ordinances that recognize a watershed or, support the defense of a certain ecosystem. And at the local level, it's had an impact. We haven't seen the impact at the national and international level yet, but it's a powerful idea, and I think give it 20, 30 years, we could see this as the frontier of rights. However, I think that, what are we up against? Like you said earlier, it's that paradigm of the capitalist global economic system that sees nature as raw materials for continued conversion to more wealth and the enrichment of a few who own the means of production and means of capital. And so that's one system that we're at odds with. And the other system looks at well-being, looks at how you benefit from your livelihood benefits from a forest, a living forest, where the example would be you are enjoying the fruits of the trees, not actually cutting the trees that bear the fruit, and that you live in harmony and reverence and respect and reciprocity, and you think about long term, like the indigenous people say in 7th generations, we want these forests to still be here, to still support biodiversity, to still have the same animals, and to still be incredibly, have their integrity maintained, and to still have the spirits living in them. A lot of the people we work with talk about how these forests are not just full of animals and plants, but they have, literally the forest is a living being. It has a spirit. It is an entity. And they see and interact with those entities. And that's the big difference. And I think that, as we seek to address the planetary crises of climate change and everything else we're facing right now, this debate is going to become more and more critical, because it ultimately highlights the fundamental problems in our worldview as being separate from nature versus being interdependent, and seeing ourselves as dominating nature versus recognizing we're part of the web of life, that ultimately the primacy of the web of life is paramount, and what keeps us alive.
One final point is, and that is how you would go about making the change that would return us to the original operating instructions, as it were. And you were part of I think a very imaginative way of doing that, and that's the summit at the end of the rights of, or the tribunal at the ends of the Rights of Earth summit.
Yes.
Tell me about that.
That was one of the most powerful experiences I've ever been a part of. I could not hold back, the tears throughout the whole thing. You had, here you were being charged with being judges for the rights of nature and thinking of nature and how nature was abused and destroyed and devastated and pillaged by these different cases. And you're sitting there, you're listening to these experts bring about the evidence of all the damage to the rights of Mother Nature, to the rights of nature being able to sustain itself. Spills like the BP oil spill, the Chevron Texaco spill, the issues around the drilling in the Yasuni, coal mining that's threatening the entire barrier reef in Australia, the most productive marine, ecosystem. And so you're sitting there and you're saying, let me think as if I was the barrier reef. Let me think as if I was the ocean. Let me think as if I was the forest. And it was pretty emotional and amazing to be there and to basically say, this citizens tribunal is going to think of Mother Nature and the rights of nature as paramount. And through that lens, we're going to look at not just environmental damage or environmental justice, but the rights of the species that live in these forests and the human populations that suffer as well, and the ecosystems in general and their health and well-being, and try these cases from that perspective. So we had our first meeting. There was 10 judges, 9 cases. We plan on deliberating on these cases and issuing our rulings and our judgments at the next annual big gathering, global gathering, which will be in Lima this December around the Conference of Parties on Climate Change. And I'm very excited about this. It's something that could be replicated by other jurisdictions, localities, these kinds of tribunals. We've seen them work well in the case of human rights violations, and now we're looking at them from a perspective of the rights of nature. It's quite exciting and very inspiring, and it allows the public to be part of a process of basically articulation and expression of our value system, a new value system.
What you actually had there was almost like a discovery session in a traditional criminal trial, where a group of individuals brought the evidence that would justify a full-out trial for, let's say, BP in the case of the oil spill in the Gulf of Mexico, or the United States, and I've forgotten a couple of those, how a couple of those went, but they were very specific cases. Same thing with Chevron Toxico, right? And so the prosecutor,
the Earth
prosecutor draws on expert testimony to say this is why these people should be sanctioned and should have to, or these organizations, and should have to make some kind of reparations for this and should suffer some penalties from it. And one of the things I thought was tremendously powerful was that this never happens if the case is big enough. I mean, there are some penalties for BP. They're trivial compared to the offense, right? And there's never a trial of this. So now you've got all these cases accepted for trial by the tribunal of which you're a member. And then the next stage is presumably to take them to trial and call the witnesses from the people who are accused, or the organizations that are accused, and come to a determination, which means nothing in terms of power, but may mean everything in terms of influence.
Exactly, because you're talking about shifting societal perspective and creating a popular understanding of rights of nature. And I think the tribunal helps crystallize what are the rights of nature, why the rights of nature, and helps you put yourself out of your anthropocentric framework of me, human communities as dominating, to a perspective where you think about a species that's going to go extinct. You think about the turtles. You think about the sharks that were harmed in the BP oil spill. You think about even isolated, uncontacted tribes who are basically being displaced and, facing ethnocide in the case of the Yasuni National Park, where there are isolated tribes who are being driven away by oil companies. So yeah, it's a powerful tool to help shift consciousness and get us to think outside of our anthropocentric worldview. And it's an empowerment tool, allowing communities to basically have popular trials that help expose. Whether it'll have any power to actually force a judgment against the company is not the point. We're talking about laying the groundwork for new legal frameworks and for new understanding around, again, the primacy of the web of life.
Amazon Watch strongly supports the indigenous plaintiffs in the famous Chevron Toxico case against Texaco and its successor Chevron. For a closer look at that story, please watch our Green interview with Pablo Fajardo and Steve Donziger, the lawyers who've been leading that case. You may also want to view our interviews with Peruvian indigenous leader Santiago Manuel Valera and with Ecuador's remarkable former energy minister Alberto Acosta. For the Green interview, I'm Silver Donald Cameron. Thanks for joining us.